The world is in a climate crisis, and all industries must do their part to reach zero emissions. Maritime trade is critical to today's society, but is also responsible for 2.8% of all greenhouse gases. A future where global trade reaches zero is possible, but how do we actually get there? I'm Lora Jakobsen, ZeroNorth's Chief Purpose Activist and an expert in sustainable shipping. In Navigating Zero, I'm sitting down with thought leaders to explore the inner workings of global trade, its massive impact on our society, and the obstacles it faces in navigating its way to zero. It's hard to underestimate the importance of ports in our world. They are the start and the end of every voyage. And today, an estimated 90% of all goods are transported by sea. As a vital link between land and sea, ports can also be an important testing ground for digital transformation and green technologies. Today's guest is Saskia Mureau, Head of Digital at the Port of Rotterdam. Saskia focuses on customer experience, which involves everything from supply chain to land leases. Saskia also leads the groundbreaking green and digital corridor between the Port of Rotterdam and the Port of Singapore. I'm excited to talk to her about that, but first I want to start at the beginning and ask why in the 1990s the Port of Rotterdam decided to focus on digital transformation.
We believe that it is a necessity for the ease of doing business. And we believe that it's important that customers, operators, vessels can do good business and efficient business in the port. Digitalisation will help with that. But more so, we start to see how the twin transition and the decarbonisation is going to make a difference to our port. We think that for tackling the climate challenge, it's important, but it's also really important for all of our customers who want to launch sustainability propositions to their customers. And I think end of the day, the consumers want to make better choices for the environment. And if you can enable that, if we can make sure that a retailer can offer green shipping in some way or form, we believe that enabling that is a key part.
And maybe so our audience who's not as familiar with ports, what exactly does it entail to enable the digital change for your customers?
So if we look at the port goal to start with, it's about just-in-time sailing. So how do we ensure that vessels don't go very fast to Port of Rotterdam, then have long waiting time at anchorage because their terminal is not ready? How can we make sure that we somehow make that a much easier process? And I think more and more so the vessels have software enabling them to do route optimization. And if we're able to tell them when a terminal is ready for them, they can slow steam that last bit. And as a result, we can save anywhere between 4 and 15% in fuel consumption and thus emissions. That's one part. I think a second piece is data sharing in the supply chain. There's lots of inefficiencies in the supply chain. So how can we make sure that a truck operator from Germany knows when their container is ready to be picked up, so they don't stand in line waiting for that container, but it's a seamless process. Again, that saves fuel consumption. And then I think another example is how do we enable retailers to ultimately make the right choice in how they ship their cargo. So if you look at a solution we have called Route Scanner, a retailer can say, I want to ship my container from, let's say, somewhere village in China to a factory or their shop in Germany. Route Scanner will give them the optimized route, looking at maybe 200 different options. And because we worked with all the ports and all the operators of train, rail, roads, we can give them reliable choices and they can choose how to best make the sustainable choice.
That's super interesting. You mentioned the just-on-time arrival, which is really about making sure a vessel doesn't use more fuel than it needs to consume and gets into the port or a berth without having to wait. There's something in the industry called Sail Fast and Wait, which is an initiative really about making sure that you're optimizing the way you sail so that you're not trying to get to a port if you have to wait. So avoiding sailing fast and then waiting. So is there other initiatives that you know around this across other ports that you're working with to enable the Sail Fast and Wait agenda?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I think a big one for us is with Singapore. You might know that we have a green and digital corridor with Singapore. It's a very deliberate decision to put digital in that because we believe in the short term, digital is the one that will make a difference. In that, we're specifically looking at exactly that. And you might say, okay, is it really going to make such a difference if Port of Rotterdam and Port of Singapore exchange data? Yes, it will make a first step, but then we're looking at the ports along the route to start seeing, okay, where do vessels stop? How can we get those ports into the data sharing piece together and as a result give different guidance on vessel route optimization? I think another piece is we are currently looking at putting in a geofence. Currently, vessels get a 3-hour warning on pilot boarding area when they arrive. And then at the moment they arrive there, it's about 3 hours out from Port of Rotterdam. All the nautical service providers and the terminals will get a notification. A vessel has arrived at pilot boarding area. We're now changing that to 12 hours out, 240 nautical miles. And that geofencing enables the whole system in Rotterdam to then act faster. That's something that we then do in conjunction with ports nearby because some of the ports in Europe are within that 240 nautical mile geofence. Other ports are further out, and then we work together in enabling that data exchange.
You mentioned the Green Corridor. Can you explain a little bit about what that means to everyone who's listening?
So the Green and Digital Corridor is, I think, one of the longest or largest green corridors out there. In our case, it is a container liner collaboration with many parties along that route to see how we can accelerate the transition to zero and low carbon fuels. It's a collaboration of 23 different parties, ranging from 5 container liners to global institutes like GMF or Maersk Mckinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping. And together with a whole host of people, we look at how can we just speed it up and how can we get pilots for the new fuels, how can we deliver the new infrastructure, and how can we ultimately deal with the premium on the new fuels that we see arise.
The industry talks a lot about green corridors, but you've made it specific now twice to say green and digital corridors. So can you explain to me why you're adding that bit and what's different about that part?
We believe that, if you look at what is going to make the largest difference, then obviously fuel choice plays a huge role. And it particularly plays a huge role further out in the decade. But the fuel that is best is the fuel you don't burn. And digital will make sure that we reduce the fuel that is burned. On a shorter term, we believe that 15% of the total reduction can come through digital. It's efficiencies, it's things like slow steaming, it is a different behavior in ports. And as a result, we reduce the emissions quicker.
Thank you for explaining that, because I think that's an important part, the digitalization of ports, the digitalization of the bunker industry. And if you talk a little bit about your learnings from the green and digital corridor work with Singapore, is there some things that you can share with other ports that then they can take upon themselves? What is the challenges in doing that? And what are some of the wins that you've had?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges is actually at what point do you communicate learnings? Because we never started this to be exclusive to Singapore and Rotterdam. We always wanted to make sure that whatever we figure out as 2 big ports, we can then distribute and share with others. And it's always a matter of when is the right time for that. But luckily we have partners like the Global Maritime Forum and a number of others who help distribute those learnings. I think if you zoom out a bit, then I think the largest learning or the biggest learning is that through partnering in the whole supply chain, we have enabled parties to grasp the full complexity of the challenge. And because it's such a system change that you all have a role to play, but you also need to make sure that somehow that's all interconnected. The other part is that it's such a big thing, you also need to just try stuff. And I'm particularly proud of the work we did around ZEMBA, the Zero Emission Buyer Alliance that Aspen Institute started, where a number of retailers got together and said, we need to send a buying signal to fuel suppliers. And they basically tendered for volume as zero and low carbon or zero carbon volume for delivery in the next years to come, because most of that fuel is not available today. What we did as a port, we said that's really quite amazing. Can we somehow put in an incentive for those companies who won the tender with Zamba? We did that in a matter of weeks. We said we're going to waive port dues up to 500k for people who come in under the Zamba banner, basically. And I mean, that's a complete novel way of working for us, to just try stuff and say, how about we do this?
By running pilots and experimenting, we can better understand new requirements and also discover the type of questions we should be asking in the future. This will lead us to finding innovations necessary to solve our most complex problems. Dr. Patrick Verhoeven, Managing Director of the International Association of Ports and Harbors, said that when thinking about promoting an innovation mindset at ports, quote, "A lot of it is about thinking differently. Different may not always be better, but better is always different," end quote. I think what Patrick is saying here is that business as usual is very rarely better when it comes to innovation. Many of us still need to shift towards an innovation mindset to make progress. But according to Saskia, this way of thinking is already embedded at the Port of Rotterdam.
Port of Rotterdam has always been very high on innovation. So we do trial loads of things, ranging from battery swapping for inland barging to a huge carbon capture storage project. So the innovation as such is not new, but I think the new piece is that we're also applying that now on pricing frameworks and maybe even regulation at times. That's the area that we're less trial and error attitude. If I look at the broader energy transition and what happens in a port, it's a huge challenge from where we are today and where we need to go. We need different pillars ranging from energy transition of the transport system to the whole energy system, because the Port of Rotterdam has a large area of land lease customers. We have refinery, chemical plants, we have a huge amount of warehouses, food hubs, pharma facilities, all sorts of things. And the transition of that whole system of industrial activity also needs to happen, which is partly an energy sort of transition and electricity challenge, and is somehow that needs to be coordinated. So that's a piece that we look at, and definitely innovation plays a big part there.
You mentioned that there's something around these policies that you also are innovating around. Is it the Rotterdam Port Authority, the one who's making the policies, or who is in charge of policies around the port?
Yeah, so that depends on national policies. There's also EU policy, regulation, and there are specific things for the Port of Rotterdam as a company. So port dues, for example, are part of the remit of the Port of Rotterdam as a company. Then obviously we work with national and EU regulators to help and influence and to bring experiences to the new regulation that is to come in. And I think the whole piece around premium on new fuels is a good example where, as part of the Green and Digital Corridor, we established a work stream that looks at finance and regulation, and particularly checks what maybe subsidies in the short term or what regulation in the longer term do we need to bridge. What can we learn from maybe other industries like offshore wind in the UK with their contracts for difference? What are the things that you can pick up that work and then bring back to the regulators?
I mean, it's very interesting. You've talked about the energy transition and what policies and different initiatives will help drive change. And if you look at from a digital point of view, what do you think policies could help drive change? And maybe this is a leading question, because I do want to talk to you and ask you about the EBDN, which is the Electronic Bunker Delivery Note, which ZeroNorth is also providing through a pilot project that we did with the Maritime Port Authority in Singapore, where we spent months and months developing something together and then through pilots released it. Curious to know your input on that.
Obviously, the whole how do we go paperless is a huge subject. And I think local regulation plays a key part there. We do see that the moment you go paperless, it really changes your whole physical flow. And as a result, makes it often much more efficient. And we recently saw in work that we did with the Port of Tangermet that sometimes a vessel arrives and the paperwork only arrives 3 days later. And physical activity cannot happen as a result of that, which is just mind-blowing in my view. So paperless is a big part of that, the e-bill of lading and the e-bunker note being the two key documents. And I think in that, what we see is not so much the challenge of taking a current sort of document and digitalizing that in the very same way as the document was. It's the data elements that start to populate all sorts of documents and processes, and as a result you can change the way you operate, and that's the real challenge. It's not so much how do we go from one to the other, but how do we then rethink and reimagine what supply chains could look like. I love the work that you did with Singapore on the e-bunker note. We're slightly jealous, I would say. And at the same time also working on that ourselves and taking learnings from what has happened in Singapore and how we can apply it in the same way that Singapore and other areas takes our learnings. And that was the whole purpose of the corridor work that we do, is how can you speed up learning? Because ultimately this is about customers who run global supply chains, and it makes no sense to have one process in one port and another in another port. So somehow we need to make that more seamless for those operating global supply chains.
The Port of Rotterdam is active on the global stage. Outside of their work with the Port of Singapore, they collaborate with other ports all over the world to promote a standard of data sharing and usage. Saskia says that establishing these standards across the supply chain is an ongoing process, but that it has helped encourage more startups, ports, and other supply chain participants to move the needle on digitalization. I'd like Saskia to share her thoughts on the lack of digital literacy in our industry, a topic that she's spoken about before publicly.
It's a good question. I think digital brings efficiency, and so far it's always been in the light of efficiency, and that's very well, but it's one of the most complex industries in the world. And I've worked in almost all different B2B industries, and this one is so interlinked, even more so than aviation. And then the percentage of sort of the efficiency versus maybe the value of the trade, especially in the sort of wet bulk or the bulk industry, has always been small. So the complexity with the value was not that appealing, I think. Then at the same time, now the emission challenges come in. That is going to change in my view. Also because it makes collaboration more possible. And the last decade, many companies have done their individual digital transformations, but the name of the game for the next decade is collaboration across the chains. And it's all about how do you share data and how do you enable sort of seeing one another's planning instead of optimizing just your own. So with that emission challenge that comes from a shareholder perspective and a different part of the company basically wanting to see progress, combined with the new pricing mechanisms coming in, like ETS, the size of the price is also going up. In that sense, I think digital is becoming much more important than it ever was before. As a result, we'll see more people skill up or upskill.
I think one of the really interesting things about the digital transformation of our industry is that it's leading the way for us to also utilize all the amount of data that's been collected and use it to build baselines. And if we're going to reach zero emissions, we need to be able to measure what we are improving upon. An initiative that you just mentioned, the EU ETS, I think if we can talk about that for a minute. First of all, can we talk about what the EU ETS does from a port's point of view? And then maybe we can take a second question, which is, have you seen a change in behavior because of this?
First of all, I absolutely love the fact that you say data and analytics and insights, and knowing where we start from is a key sort of enabler that we desperately need. I would say it's one of the biggest challenges for me and my team is looking at how do we put this layer of data and analytics over the port, start measuring performance of the port as a system, because all the individual actors have their role to play, but ultimately we need to make sure that the asset utilization is where it needs to be, but also that we see the behavior from people that we need to in order to reduce those emissions overall. And I think ETS is making our lives easier because now it's really easy for us to say, okay, we see this type of behavior, and let's say this ferry or this container liner or this chemical vessel or this customer is having this type of behavior. If they were to do something differently, we recently saw that with a fleet of 7, where we saw that if 4 vessels would display the same behavior as the 3 other vessels, it would reduce 650,000 on their ETS bill for 2024. That makes it a lot easier for us to go to that company and say, hey, are you aware of that? Do you know what is behind it? We offer great quality analytics. They have their business insights. Might also have analytics departments or might not. Depends on how big they are. But together we can then say, okay, what would make sense in this case? And I believe having that analytics as a basis and knowing what we're striving for is going to make a difference. And then the big bonus will be, of course, that the ETS bill will be lower.
I wanted to wrap it up a little bit by getting into what do you think that we need to do from a digital point of view, from an industry point of view? And maybe you can break it down into 2 parts. One is for people who are not very advanced in their digital transformation and, ones who are maybe more advanced. What do they need to improve on?
Let's start with the ones who are less advanced. I would start by investing in 2 things. One is in data. So start looking at how can you share your own data, what access can you get to other people's data, and how can that improve your planning process or your voyage or whatever is the metric that you're after. And the second piece is work with startups, because they will often have solutions for the problems you identify. So try to figure out where innovation happens, do a bit of scouting and just try stuff. Don't stand on the sideline, but step into the arena and start learning. For the ones who are more advanced, we need companies to take a bit more risk and to approach new stuff to help us reimagine what things could look like if we have that paperless future, if we have AI-assisted planning at scale, if we do share data across supply chains, what would the value be? We really need people who are willing to take a bit more of a plunge also in sharing data and doing that together.
As vessels become more digitally sophisticated, ports need to innovate. It's sometimes difficult to know where to start when it comes to technological innovation. The Port of Rotterdam has cultivated a culture of experimentation and digitalization over many decades. If we can shift our collective mindset towards a curious one, where experimenting is the norm, then maybe starting will be easier. I'd like to round off our conversation by talking about the future and what the Port of Rotterdam has planned for its customers.
Yeah, so I think the biggest one is that we're looking at making data accessible at scale, but do that in a federative way. So what it means is that we will have an API marketplace where we enable everyone to see what data is available in the Rotterdam ecosystem, but also what services are available in the Rotterdam ecosystem. So you can come as a real operator or as a retailer and you can see what APIs, what data is available, what startup services, scale-up services are available for the areas that I'm interested in, because we believe that somehow matching innovation and all the great work that happens in the startup scale-up space needs to match with companies who need to use that and who are basically the problem owners. So that's a big one. And it does mean that we'll start to make also our own data available at scale more. So for example, a big thing we'll do this year is we'll make birth data available to people to ensure, a bit like the GLM number you have on a vessel, which is unique. We start to have unique location identifiers for all the birth data, all the terminals, commercial, non-commercial, in the Rotterdam port. We'll have other data available like hydrometeo data, for example. And in the future, I think sensor data of keys and all these different things. So to really power that data sharing, but between parties, not so much everything to one place, but people can exchange that together. So I think that's a big one. The second piece is more around the energy system. So anyone who is a land lease customer for us will start to see hopefully cheaper and available energy. So we're looking at traded propositions, we're looking at industrial sharing and things like that. And from a supply chain perspective, it's enabling data sharing at more scale. We've got an amazing port community system called Portbase. So we work with the 3,500 companies that operate in the Port of Rotterdam to enable that data sharing and to make sure that somehow the seaside and the whole hinterland that connects, because that's a key piece that we need to get right to be able to deal with all the logistics.
Yeah, incredible things that you guys are doing. You mentioned one that caught my eye, which is the availability of data from the ports. And what is the benefit to opening up the, names and numbers of the berths?
The real benefit is that we all talk about the same thing and that somehow we're able to match vessel and berth together. Are they compatible? What is the length, the width, all these different things? And we make sure that the naming conventions are the same, because sometimes the agents use one name, the terminal might use another, a vessel from Hong Kong might use a third, and we're not talking about the same thing. And as a result, we see a lot of incompatible berth vessel matches, and I think that whole process could be much more efficient.
Interesting. I've heard in the market that maybe there's an unfair advantage to ship owners who don't own their own terminals. And they would have more of an ability to be able to do the sail fast and wait, if we circle back to the conversation we had at the beginning, because they could determine their vessel, they know when they're going to be there. And other vessels maybe don't have that advantage. Maybe you can demystify this rumor.
I mean, you see that different companies make different choices on vertical integration and where they want to be in the supply chain. And you see anything ranging from, I just want to operate in one part of the supply chain and do that extremely well, to those who have propositions across different parts of a supply chain with the different pros and cons that brings. I think ultimately terminals do have a say in when they're able to receive a vessel. And this is where we want to make that data much more transparent. And also the piece I talked about, the geofencing, so people know earlier when a vessel really is ready to go to a terminal, to make that match better. And yeah, I think people can then use that data to their own advantage. And as a port authority, we always need to make sure that we create a fair system, and we believe in data transparency as a part of that.
Technology exists today which can help us to better understand the flows of global trade, the bunker needed to supply its movement, and the innovations to improve the efficiency of ports to reduce industry emissions impact. We need technology, data, and innovation to reach zero emissions, but it's also important to build trust between all stakeholders. Saskia's colleague, Martin Thyssen, head of Global Connect at the Port of Rotterdam, described building trust as, quote, the biggest challenge in the future, end quote. In our industry, there may be an aversion to sharing data to maintain competitive advantage. Martin disagrees. Quote, we do not foresee digitalization resulting in parties trying to grab a piece of each other's pie, end quote. I really enjoyed my conversation with Saskia today. She's made some good points about the way ports are navigating their way to zero. For example, the green transition cannot happen without the digital one. These two go hand in hand. And we need more people to share data throughout the supply chain. This will also help hold the industry accountable for its successes and its failures. Thank you so much to Saskia Mureau for joining me today. And thank you for listening to Navigating Zero, Global Trade's powerful wave of change. If this conversation has inspired you, please follow us on your podcast app of choice for more fascinating discussions on how we reach zero emissions. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, which you can find a link in the show notes. Bye for now.